Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Cyclonic Thrift Podcast, a series focusing on deck building, card analysis, and financial speculation, all through the eyes of a commander player on a budget. I'm one of your hosts, Christian, joined as always by
Zach. Welcome, everyone.
And we're happy to have you. So, as we talked about in our first episode, we plan on doing deck techs on this podcast eventually. We have one kind of figured out and set up for an episode here soon, but before we jumped into that, Zach had been talking to me and he said, why don't we look at just what makes a deck in budget? What's it comprised of? How's it different from a normal deck, if at all? And after talking about that, we kind of were like, hey, what about the playgroup? How's the playgroup change in a budget environment? And then from there, I started saying, well, you can't talk about the deck without talking about the commander. So all these ideas kind of came together, and it eventually turned into what you're listening to now, and that is we're doing a small 3-part mini-series on the analysis of a budget environment. And Zach and I are going to take you through all components of that environment, the commander, the deck, the playgroup, and we're just going to break it all down. And on this episode, the first part, we'll be talking about the commander. So we'll be talking about choosing a commander to play, why you choose them, how impactful are the colors when you make that decision, different archetypes and game plans, all those different things, just specifically focusing on the commander and how it's different in a budget environment, if at all. And I think you'll see that playing this budget format, it's really not that different from playing a normal competitive format in some cases, while others, it is a little different. And we'll get into that. So, Zach, is there anything you want to add on to that before we jump in?
No, I think that was good. Like Christian said, we really just want to kind of introduce how our playgroup works, what our typical decks looks like before we really get into going through deck by deck and doing deck techs. We want to make sure we present the whole kind of overview of the playgroup and what the format really looks like as opposed to your typical commander table.
Yep. So with that said, we're going to jump in on our first part, the commander. Zach, so developing a commander deck, what's the first thing you go about when doing so? How do you choose your commander?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that I personally would choose a commander. So I'll kind of go through a few different ones. For one thing, a lot of times I have a specific like archetype or theme in mind. Like when I built my most recent deck, Corvold, I really wanted to do something different. Most of my decks that I have right now are Simic or Sultai and are typically combo decks. And I wanted to do something that was more like graveyard recursion based with a lot of sacrifice and things like that. So, at that point, I went and looked at what are good sacrifice commanders, and obviously Corvold is really powerful in that archetype. So that's one way that you choose. And something else that I do sometimes, to be honest, is just if I see something come out that I think is really cool, then I'll build that. That was kind of the case with my Yarok deck. Is like I saw this card come out in the spoilers, and I was like, yeah, I really want to build this guy. I think this just looks really cool. It looks like something I would enjoy playing. So I think those are the main two ways that I usually go about it.
Yeah, that's part of it for me, especially with your Yarok analysis. When I see a card come out and then, Yarok, he cares about ETBs, obviously, and then you immediately start thinking, oh, wow, Meteor Golem going off twice, Ravenous Chupacabra going off twice, what else going off twice? Like, those type of things get me excited, like, wow, how these cards that are already good, they just become insane with this commander. And those are the types of things I look for when choosing a commander myself. Another thing for me, colors do matter to a degree. For the longest time, you can ask Zach, I only built commanders if they had green in them. Because I like green. It's just how I like to play the game. I like what colors it offers. I like the cards it has. I love ramping. I love just tutoring up lands and putting them on the battlefield and having, more lands than I can count. So that's another thing. If you like going really fast and just hitting people in the face, definitely consider having a deck with red in it. If that is your style, then I wouldn't go for, say, a blue-black deck, right, Zach? If you want to be going quick, that's probably not where you want to be. So that should probably, take some kind of precedence when choosing a commander.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, like you said, there's different play styles. If you want to go fast, just have a lot of combat. Maybe you're interested in doing like extra combats. That's a very red mechanic generally in the color pie.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and then, if you want a lot of lands, like you said, obviously green is the way to go for that. And there's other considerations with color. Like I said, color pies are really, uh, if you know what you want your deck to do, then usually you can figure out, okay, these are the colors that are generally going to be good or be able to do that specific mechanic that I'm looking for. Like if I wanted to build a treasure deck or something like that, red has a lot of treasures. Black has some treasure mechanics. It's
Mm-hmm.
really a very very red mechanic. And if I want to be casting a lot of counter spells and things like that, I'll build a blue deck.
Yeah, yeah. The color pie is really like over the years. Some people might say it's gotten worse or better, or it's not as specific as it once was. I think it's getting more vast. So treasures are fairly recent. We had gold tokens and theros and stuff like that, but these different colors are always getting new things that make them that color. Like Zach was saying, you see treasures a lot in red and black. So that's something to look forward to when choosing your deck is all these new mechanics that are coming up, more color specific. And that matters too. The color pie is just really, really interesting, and understanding it can really help you choose a commander. Um, Another component for me, Zach, I don't know how impactful this is for you. I'd imagine fairly impactful, but when I look at a commander, I also consider how much will this deck win? Because, and I don't want that to sound like really spike or anything, but I don't really want to build a deck if I'm just going to lose every game.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I love playing Magic, but winning is at the end of the day always going to be fun, regardless of how much you are competitive or anything like that. I think everybody that plays games like this at the end of the day is going to want to win, more than they're going to want to lose. So it's obviously power differs between different commanders, especially when you look at specific archetype like you know I could play Bruce Tarl over Xenagos or something like that. They're both going to be making my creatures hit harder and kind of a similar thing. But at the end of the day, Xenagos is most likely going to win more if my goal is to just get as many big creatures out onto the board as possible. So that's definitely a consideration.
Yeah, because there's plenty of commanders that have come out. I can't remember the name of it. There's a red white one. I think it came out. I'm sorry, not red white, blue white that came out. I think in Jumpstart, and it was someone the shifting wind or something like that. And they're really unique and really cool. And they dealt with flying and gaining control of permanence of the player to your left and the whole way around the table. And I'm like, wow, that's super cool. And I'd love to do that. But I'm also thinking, man, is this deck ever going to get me a win? Am I just going to be sitting there every game doing the same thing and just losing over and over? And like you said, like that is a consideration because after losing 10 games, you're probably going to be a little bit bummed. And that's just not where I want to be. So, how powerful it is, how often it can win is definitely something I consider when choosing a commander.
Yeah.
Um, there's plenty of other reasons to choose a commander. We're not going to cover them all because everyone has their own reasons. Um, but in budget in particular, there is an important one I think Zach and I want to cover, and that is being aware of your options in the budget format. There are several commanders that you look at them and you're like, okay, this card is insane. I want to build it. It's awesome. But then you got to keep in mind that $50 budget. And looking at the cards that are critical to that commander, making them work, the best cards for it, sometimes every card is just in that $4+ range. And it's just really not going to happen with that commander, which is kind of a downside of the format. We can't deny that, but you can still build it. It just may not be as well oiled as it could be, right, Zach?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, there are plenty of commanders that you could build a $2,000-3,000 deck that's going to win on turn 2 or 3, and that would be the perfect commander for it. But uh, it could be really difficult to do that in budget. Just like Christian said, based on different restrictions Like, for example, I was looking at Najila a while back. She's a 5-color commander and generally wins through like an extra turns combo. But 5-color and even 4-color and budget are really difficult just because of the mana base. It's hard to be consistent. So, that's kind of another consideration you have to do is, do I really want to build a 4 or 5-color deck and spend half of my budget on these lands just so that I can ensure that I can cast my commander, do what I need to do to actually play versus spending the money on win conditions.
Yeah, a good example also for me is Aura Skyclave Hierophant. Um, he's a black and a white commander. He cares about clerics, and Zach knows I've mentioned wanting to build him like 10 times and never have. And part of the reason, the prices have come down a little bit in some of the cards, but part of the reason is clerics are expensive, at least the ones that would make the deck really work. And it's not necessarily the same as the whole will it win problem, but it kind of ties in with that, in that I'm just going to be playing a bunch of clerics that don't do anything. Sure, he'll use his ability and there'll be some things, but at the end of the day, it's just not going to feel like it would be almost like a shadow of the deck it could have been. And that's just not really really where I want to be when building a commander.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting kind of scenario you brought up because it's like a tribal thing, and a lot of times we don't have a lot of tribal decks in our playgroup, just because I think tribal is difficult to build with a budget, just because the best cards are always going to be more expensive because they're the best cards for that particular tribe. Like if you look at Merfolk, all the best Merfolk cards are going to be more expensive because they're going to be playable in other formats. Whereas, if you're just building a combo deck or something, you can probably find another card with a similar effect that's not extremely expensive, just due to the words or the types it has in it.
Right, exactly. That's a good way to analyze that. I think that was summed it up really well. Um, so yeah, like I said, we can't cover every decision that goes into actually choosing your commander. We kind of hit the big ones. Can it win? What colors is it? How cool you think it is, and then the budget. Potential restrictions that could surround cards that make it work. So let's just say you have chosen your commander. Moving on from that, Zach mentioned this a little bit earlier. That's what we're getting into next, and that's the archetype. Now, you can look at a commander, and sometimes their ability is so versatile that it could fit into more than one archetype. You could build it that way, right? Or you could, or it's very obvious what archetype should be built with this. A good example is typically blue black commanders. You could do a mill build, you could do a graveyard. A lot they've been going more in with rogues and ninjas, so it's creature heavy. Blue black tends to offer commanders that can go one way or another, whereas red white commanders are typically very obviously in your face, just hit people in the face, and that's okay. It's just a matter of identifying that archetype. So that's what we're going to get into now. Identifying an archetype, and how do you go about pursuing that archetype, and honestly, what is an archetype for all the new players out there? Zach, I don't know if you want to take us off on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So an archetype really boils down to what the deck does, kind of in its rawest form. Before you even really consider colors or anything like that, this is kind of something you want to think about at a higher level. Is like, do I want to build a really fast deck, which would be like an aggro deck that's just gonna be all about attacking and trying to get creatures out early, or would I rather play the long game with a control type deck where I'm just gonna be countering things or trying to pillow fort myself so I can uh, last out through the game and not have people kill me early on, and then get to my more expensive win cons, maybe like Knowledge Pool or something like that, or Approach of the Second Sun that's going to be difficult to cast early on in the game? Or am I just looking to assemble a certain uh, combination of cards in my deck, like Deadeye Navigator, Peregrine Drake type of deck, where I'm just kind of drawing cards, thinking through the deck, really looking for that perfect combination that's going to win me the game on the spot?
Right. And these archetypes, they go so much deeper than aggro combo control. Zach and I had a couple conversations about, should we include mid range as a fourth? is mid-range. Should mid-range be there instead of combo? Does combo fall under mid-range in reality? And that's up for debate one way or another. But we just went with a standard aggro control combo, or the three overarching archetypes. And within each of those, there's a variety of different archetypes. Aggro could be token decks, elf ball, battle cruiser. There's tons of different sub archetypes within these major three, if you will. And once you've decided on which of those you want to do, you can really start getting into the meat of the deck, the 99, as it were. And if you don't have an archetype decided, you're going to be in trouble because it's very vital to make that decision. Otherwise, your deck will have what Zach and I usually call an identity crisis. Your deck will be, 10% of it will be a bunch of tokens. The other half will be just counter spells. And then you'll have some effects that care about counters sometimes. And it's just a muddy mess that doesn't actually do anything all game because it's not pushing for one idea. And like we said, in this case, that could be aggro, just hitting phase, control, just stopping your opponents from playing, or combo, getting that machine online until you can just win the game. So it's very, very important to decide what the archetype is going to be for this deck. And I wouldn't say there's always a best option for every commander because, like I said, there could be multiple. But if you can really target what the best way to play this commander is, your deck is really going to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Christian said a few minutes ago, here's not every deck is, or not every commander is going to have, the perfect way to build the deck. Like Yarok, I think is a good example because we talked about him a little bit, but essentially what he does is you get double enter the battlefield triggers. So there are, a ton of different ways to build that. I've seen people do like an elemental theme with a lot of elemental ETBs. My deck personally is just like Sultai good stuff ETBs, so it's not really like one tribe or anything like that. It's just trying to assemble a combo. So it's just there are a lot of different ways to build some of these commanders. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, you might have something like Phoenix, which basically says gives your other creatures an ability where you can tap them and mill a specific opponent for that many cards equal to the tapped creature's power, or sorry, their toughness. So there's really only one way to build that at the end of the day because you're going to be trying to mill people. So there's definitely opposite ends of the spectrum as far as what kind of restraints you have on what you could put in a deck and how it's going to win.
Right, exactly. Now, let's say you've chosen your commander, and then you have decided you are going to build an aggro deck as your archetype. Now, the next decision is the game plan. How are you going to push your decided archetype? What cards are you going to include to make sure that what you're doing is what you want to be doing? And again, this is going to come down to what your archetype was. So, saying aggro as an example, your game plan should be dedicated to achieving the goal of aggro, which is hitting people. So, what kind of cards you want to run? You want to run cards that make tokens, or creatures that get to attack multiple times, or things that pump all your creatures to do more damage. All these things should push the game plan of whatever archetype you've chosen. And the game plan isn't necessarily how you're going to win the game, it's just getting you closer to doing so. And all these cards in the game plan are what generally most players, Zach and I included, consider the gas of the deck. It's just good cards that get the job done of whatever your deck is supposed to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we've talked about a little bit in other episodes, you want to figure out, you want to get these cards like we're talking about that are going to win you the game, are going to be really synergistic with your commander and with your overall game plan. And you want to try to figure out kind of what the best of those cards are. How many am I going to need to run to be able to consistently do what I want to do and close out the game? And then how do I balance that with other things like, my mana base, my removal, anything like that. So it's definitely kind of a balancing act between all of these really strong synergy cards and then things that you need just to make sure you're not knocked out of the game or anything like that.
Right. And the whole idea of the number of cards you want in each can vary from deck to deck. We're going to get into that really deep on our second part, which is the deck, where we talk about, the types of cards, how many you should have, what their role is. So we'll get into that more on the following episode. But beyond that, it's just a matter of making sure your deck is doing what you want it to do. If you are, like we've been saying, using aggro as an example, if you're aggro, doesn't really make sense for you to be casting enchantments that, I don't know, mill your opponents. You just don't care. It in no way did this card help you hit them in the face better, if that makes sense. So your tokens are, let's say you got one pump spell out, you got 10 tokens, and you're hitting them, you're spreading the damage a little bit across your 3 opponents. You're hitting each opponent for 5-6 damage. And then you spend the next 2 turns laying casting a spell that makes them discard, and then cast a card that mills them. And all the while, you started off fine, but your opponents now have the best board state. They have a lot more health. They are blocking your tokens because you haven't spent any more time improving them by giving them keywords or pumping them or making them unblockable or something like that. So that's kind of the identity crisis we talked about. You aren't running cards for your game plan anymore, and instead you're running cards that don't help you accomplish anything. So you got to think with your archetype in mind when developing your game plan. And in this case, I'm using aggro, tokens, pump, more creatures, more combat. All these things are going to help you achieve your game plan after deciding your archetype, of course. So with that in mind, there is one major component, I should say, when playing the game. So you have your commander. You've chosen what type of archetype you want to do. In this case, aggro. You now have your game plan. How are you going to be aggro? Are you going to lay a lot of tokens? You're going to do a lot of combat. You're going to pump your creatures. Well, that's all well and good. But how do you win the game? All this on its own is fine, but is it enough to close out the game? Some decks, and sometimes it is. That's, kind of where control, wins its games. But in reality, almost every deck does or should have one or more win conditions. And that's how you win the game. Zach, do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, so a win condition is really, like Christian said, even if you're building up your board state and everything throughout the game and you're getting closer to your goal, a lot of times you really need kind of that final push to get you the win. So like in an aggro deck, like we've been talking about, there are a few different ways you could win. A common thing would be pumping your tokens, giving them, more stats, but then also giving them something like trample or menace or just unblockable, anything that would help them get through your opponent's creatures and really just get damage into your opponent themselves. So like trampling over is always good, anything like that. And then, in other decks, like we've talked about, like a control deck, maybe there can be very different win cons. Like a few of our budget control decks will run a spell called Approach of the Second Sun that essentially you have to cast it twice and you win the game, but it costs 7 mana and it gets tucked after the first time you cast it. You have to cast it again after that. So it takes a long time. So really, in that case, that's your win condition, but you've got to make sure that you can play other cards that really protect you long enough for you to be able to cast it.
Right, and that's where the game plan and the win condition go hand in hand. You get your first part of your win condition out there and casting Approach to the Second Sun the first time. Then you keep up the game plan. In this case, like you said, a control deck. You're going to be drawing a lot of cards, stopping your opponents from messing with you until you can reach that Approach to the Second Sun again. And like we talked about, that's a good example of your win condition also caring about your archetype, because if you are casting an Approach to the Second Sun and then you spend your next couple turns laying creatures and hitting people, that's not going to keep you safe and not going to get you to your Approach to the Second Sun any faster. So that's, again, it all comes full circle. Everything goes hand in hand. And sometimes without a real win condition, you just can't close out the game. Like Zach said, that extra push is what you need to actually win. You might have everything in place, but your opponent, they have just enough blockers or they have just too much life to close it out. that win condition is where it closes the gap and actually gets you the win.
Yeah, and there's a lot of cases, especially in aggro, where like, say I have 10 creatures and I could kill any one player at the table, but I know that that player is going to be able to block a certain number of them, or maybe words they'll have a kill spell to kill, whatever creature I have that's going to be getting through all the damage. So I decide, rather than kill them and maybe get some damage on another player, I'll just go all out, attack this one guy, make sure he's dead. But then, you really have to consider, if I kill this player and another player beside me is still in and there, they have a big board state. I don't know if I can beat them by myself. Is it really a good time to kill this other player, or should I wait? There's a lot of considerations going to stuff like that. Whereas maybe if you could, slam something that's going to give all your creatures trample, you don't really have to worry so much about getting chump blocked. You might be able to just kill both of them, or not have to worry so much about your creatures dying and opening you up to the other player that's still at the table.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's, we can, as you kind of picked up, this whole process has been kind of thinking of the new player in mind, or a learning player, or someone who just wants to improve at the game. At the end of the day, it's going to really, the pilot matters, right? You could spend $2,000 on a deck, but if you can't pilot it, you don't know, the best decisions you could be making, or the best timing to do things, or the optimal play, as it were. All this information can only go so far. And Zach and I, during our matches with our friends, there's plenty of politics and arguing that goes on with the most optimal play. Like, there's so many times where Zach and I are like, why aren't you destroying this threat? That's the real problem. Instead of doing what you're doing, why don't you remove that? And that player says, no, I think this is better to remove. And it's crazy. It's one of the fun things at Commander. But if you can perform as optimally as possible all the time, that's when you're going to be the best player that you can. And that's kind of what Zach was getting into a little bit with his last little mention of, should you swing out at one guy? Should you split the damage? Or what's the best way to do that? Now, Zach, so we talked about the win conditions, game plans, and choosing an archetype. In a strictly budget scope, looking through the eyes of a budget player, do any of these change a lot? If so, where and how? Is there anything that really sticks out in your mind about any of these with being budget in mind?
Yeah, I would say aggro and combo are well, actually all three, honestly. So I'll start out, I guess, with the aggro example, and where I think that kind of changes from an unlimited budget to our $50 budget format. And I think really where aggro kind of gets in trouble in budget is just being fast enough to get out in front of other decks that are going to start really coming out on turns 4 and 5 when they get their commanders out and have a decent mana base, because it is difficult to have a lot of fast mana in budget. The the typical kind of ramp suite that we're going to be running, especially outside of a green deck in budget, will be Soul Ring, maybe Arcane Signet, and then the signets in your colors, and probably the talismans in your colors. So unless you hit that Soul Ring on turn 1, it's going to be difficult to get a ton of ramp out. So that's somewhere I think aggro maybe gets in trouble, is just not being able to go fast enough. With combo, uh, it's definitely possible to build combo in aggro. It's somewhat difficult to figure out, how much should I be spending on this combo, because this is what's going to win me the game, but I don't really want to spend 20% of my budget on just Deadeye Navigator, or whatever other combo card you might be looking at, Knowledge Pool, anything like that. It's kind of hard to balance that against other cards that are actually going to be getting you to that combo piece. And then with control, I would say is probably one of the more difficult archetypes to build in budget, because a lot of the really good control stacks cards are just ridiculously expensive. If you look at things like I don't know, Winter Orb, Smokestacks, anything like that, they're outrageously expensive compared to the price of cards that we're going to be running in our budget deck. So I think that's where you kind of struggle with that. There are kind of different ways you can play control. Like there are plenty of counter spells you can run in budget that are going to be uh, playable, and you'll be able to run those in budget, but you're not going to be able to run things like I said, like a lot of the really good pillow fort things, and board wipes are limited. You're not going to be able to run a Cyclonic Thrift in budget. So it's just you have to be able to really look through and find alternate cards that maybe aren't as good as another card, but are budget and are going to be playable in the format.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when, how does budget alter the archetypes as a whole, being in this format. So I'm not going to add any more to that. I think you killed it. So I'm going to move on to how does budget affect the game plan. The game plan to me, I think you would definitely agree, Zach, is it gets pushed a lot harder in budget. And we kind of talked about this in our first episode. Uh, because of the price of your other, draw, ramp, control spells, all those different things, you end up forfeiting a little bit of your budget on those and ensuring your game plan is pushed. And I do think that could just be our play group. Not necessarily everyone would do that, but undeniably our play group really pushes their game plan. And if they didn't already, I think it definitely is partially a side effect of the budget format. Because, since you only have so much money to work with, it's almost better to just make sure you can play the game as best as you possibly can and sacrifice a little bit on a removal spell or a draw spell. You got to make sure you have those things, but instead of running, the best removal you can, like you said about a board wipe, instead of running this 4-drop board wipe, maybe you save yourself $2 and run a 6-cost board wipe and put those $2 towards your game plan in, the better counter spells that are out there in a control deck, as an example. So I think for me, that's where the game plan changes in this budget environment. It gets pushed a lot harder. You need to look at it a lot longer. You need to consider your options. How much do they outweigh any additional cards that would go in the deck? And just, if you're going to dump money, I think you dump into the game plan.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. There are exceptions to that, I think, in budget. It
Hmm.
really depends on the game plan. Like the main thing I'm thinking about is there's a Tassiger deck in our play group that's like, I think 30 couple of the cards in the deck are instants, and they're pretty much all counter spells or
Hmm.
kill target creature type spells. And that's mainly because that's what that deck does, is just try to control everybody until it can assemble the combo to win the game. But generally speaking, I would say, like you said, a lot of money gets dumped into things that are going to win me the game rather than something that I'm going to be able to interact with opponents, but not necessarily, get me closer to my goal.
Right. And that sounds like bad advice, right? You don't want to not have removal spells on hand to stop threats, but if it's between actually doing your game plan, getting you to the win, and just maybe you have to watch this creature hit you for a little bit for 2 turns, it might be worth it. It's a tough decision to make. It's going to come down to you as a player doing that balancing act, but it is definitely it needs to be considered. Now, wrapping it up
Mhm.
with the win, yeah, the wrapping up with the win condition affected by budget. You kind of jumped into this a minute ago, Zach. Uh, this is really, really where you could, if there's a $6 card that just wins you the game, do you do it or do you not? And you said in some cases you actually take the hit and do it because it literally wins you the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of like, say, uh, the Yarok deck that we're going to be doing a deck tech on in the future here. We're kind of looking at that, building it out, and we see Avengers Zendikar, and we're kind of looking at combat damage as an alternate win con in that deck. And Avengers Zendikar is obviously amazing with ETBs because he makes the plants on an ETB, and then when land ETBs, he also gets a benefit. And we ended up putting Avenger in that deck, even though it is $6 or $7 now. But we think just, there's some cards that are strong enough that you really just have to run them if you're going for that kind of play style and you think that it'll just get you to the win.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, Zach, I don't know about you, but I don't feel bad about having Avenger in there at all.
Yeah, no. I mean,
Like, the fact it's in there just feels right.
yeah, absolutely. Like, if I were teetering on the edge of whether or not I think a card should be in there, and I look at it and it's $4, $5, $6, I'm probably going to cut it and put in
Yeah.
one or two cards that are maybe I really think they're good with the deck, but maybe they're not as impactful uh, by themselves, but together and with the synergy of the deck, they're going to do more than this other card that's more expensive.
Yeah, sometimes the cards are just good enough, and Avenger was a good example for that. So yeah, good thinking on that. And another thing you mentioned about Avenger, which I think is very, very critical in the budget environment, in all environments, having alternate win cons is very important. But in budget especially, because you can't spend money on, $10 on every win con, and because you can't spend money on, $6, $7 on the absolute best draw spells that are out there, and spells that dig through your deck, you may need to find a nice handful of cheap win conditions that are there just in case, right? You're like you said, or with the Yarak deck, you can't guarantee you're always going to get to that infinite mana into infinite drain combo. So you need to have things on the backup that are affordable. And I think in budget, you probably have more of these alternate win cons because you can't guarantee getting your main win condition as easily as you can in a competitive format.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, draw spells and especially tutors are very limited in budget.
Yeah,
So,
true.
just digging through and finding those pieces is difficult. But, what happens if I go through and find these pieces and then, I go to cast my Deadeye Navigator and it gets countered and I'm tapped out or I don't have a counter spell or anything like that. And that's where recursion comes in. But again, recursion, especially good recursion, is limited and
Yep.
in budget. So it's really, at the end of the day, you want to be able to get to your primary win con, but there are just going to be games where it's not in the cards and you have to have some
Yep.
backup plan.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. So yeah, I mean, we talked about the archetype, game plan, the win condition, and we talked about each of those specifically with budget in mind. Now, we want to give you a couple real examples of these archetypes with, real card names, not just, making stuff up, right? So the first one, we're going to give you an aggro example. And I just pulled up one of my decks, and that's Winota Joiner of Forces. So looking at Winota, obviously, when I look at this deck, again, how did I choose this commander? Well, she's kind of insane. Anytime I see casting things for free, I want to do it. That's awesome. And not only for free, but really easily and a lot of times for free. So what Winota Joiner Forces says is Winota Joiner forces 2 red white for a 4/4 legendary creature human warrior. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible in a turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. So basically, anytime I attack with a non-human, she triggers, I get to lay a human for free. So obviously, attacking is in the card and laying creatures is in the card text. So immediately, I've decided Agra is my archetype. And I've already decided her is my commander for the previously mentioned reasons. So check on the commander, check on the archetype. I don't really think there's any other archetype option necessarily with her other than maybe you could do infinite combat combo deck, but that might as well be aggro. All right, so I have those two things decided. Now, what about my game plan? Obviously, it has to be in line with the archetype. In this case, Evangel of Heliod is a great example. 4 white for a 1/3 creature human cleric. When Evangel of Heliod enters the battlefield, you create a number of 1/1 white soldier creature tokens equal to your devotion to white. So again, pushing the game plan. This thing makes a ton of tokens. None of them are human, so they're going to trigger Winota. And it's in itself, is a human, so Winota can get it. It fits all the important aspects of what Winota does and how she does it and what I'm doing, which is hitting people in the face. So I want a lot of creatures. I want them quick and I want good ones. This hits nail on the head for the entire deck. So that's an example of a game plan card. Another might be Geist Honored Monk or Silverwing Squadron, things like that. And lastly, the win condition. What actually wins me the game? Great example of that is Angrass Marauders. 5 red for a 4/4 creature human pirate. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent player, it deals double that damage to that permanent player instead. So now all of a sudden, I've assembled a great board with things like Evangel of Heliod, all because I've gone with the archetype and using Winota's ability to the best of its abilities. Finally, I can close out the game by doubling all my damage across all my creatures by getting out Angrass Marauders. So boom, 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 you have your archetype, you have your game plan, you have your win condition, all in sync, and allows you to close out the game. And Winota has performed really well. And I think these were quick 3 cards. You could also look at Resolute Blade Master as a win con. Adriana Captain the Guard is another one. All these things fit the archetype, they pursue the game plan, and they have a way to win the game.
Yep, absolutely. I don't have anything to add to that. Like Christian said, Winota has definitely been performing really well ever since he built her, and I think this is a deck that really, really quickly pushes its game plan and just gets things onto the board, starts hitting people as early as it possibly can. Definitely very powerful commander, powerful deck. Yeah, so like Chris said, we're going to jump into the combo deck, which is Yarok the Desecrated. This is a deck that I've built, and obviously I've mentioned it a few times on this episode, and probably other episodes. This is probably my favorite deck. It's definitely up there, so I really enjoy this. So Yarok says he's Yarok the Desecrated, 2 black, green, blue. He's a legendary creature, elemental horror, 3/5. He has Death Touch and Lifelink. And he says if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So essentially, enter the battlefield effects get doubled. Kind of like Panharmonicon on a creature, if you're familiar with Panharmonicon. So the way that this deck works generally is combo, like we said. You're going to be drawing a lot of cards, just trying to dig through your deck, trying to find your combo pieces like Peregrine Drake, Deadeye Navigator, things like that. So the typical combo that I run in this deck is the Peregrine Drake Deadeye combo. So Peregrine Drake untaps lands when he enters, and with Yarok's ability, basically I can tap up to 10 lands, play Peregrine Drake, and I can untap all those lands when it enters the battlefield. So if we can get something like Deadeye Navigator or Shrieking Drake, where I can infinitely bounce the Peregrine Drake, I'm basically netting mana every time. So the end result is that I can have infinite of basically any color or combination of colors as long as I control lands that could produce that color. And so once you have that, there's a lot of different options. Like I said, I run a lot of cards in this deck that draw cards when they enter. I run Guardian Project and things like that that are card draw engines. So you can run win conditions like Laboratory Maniac, that if you draw the last card in your library, or try to draw a card from an empty library, then you win the game. And other options are things like Bloodhunter Bat that can deal damage to other players when they enter the battlefield. So essentially, once you have infinite mana, then you can just bounce something like Bloodhunter Bat and drain everyone else. And just to clarify, Bloodhunter Bat is a creature. He's 3 and a black. He has flying, and when he enters the battlefield, target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So essentially bounce that over and over again, targeting different opponents and just kill everyone else.
Yep. Good summary. Of course, definitely. I don't have anything to add to that. You are the Yarok expert for sure. So since I ran with one of my commanders and you did Yarok, we can tackle this one together, and that is our control archetype. And we chose one of our friends' decks, and that is Zur the Enchanter. This commander is 1 white, blue, black for a 1/4 legendary creature, human wizard with flying, and says, whenever Zur the Enchanter attacks, you may search your library for an enchantment card with converted mana cost 3 or less and put it into play. If you do, shuffle your library. So, looking at this deck, obviously, this is one of the ones that very, very much fits the mold of it could be so many different archetypes. And our friend here has built it as a control deck. So what he saw was, okay, we're an Esper. I can best control colors, almost definitely. Beyond that, Zur pulls out enchantments. There's so many enchantments that just slow down your opponents, cause problems for them, and he gets them out for free.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Christian said, Zer's going to be able to put these 3 CMC or less enchantments straight from your deck into the battlefield. That's really powerful. Kind of like Gwynota putting creatures into the battlefield. You don't have to pay for this at all. Basically, you're just getting a free enchantment every turn. Every turn that you can attack with Zer, I should say. So there's a kind of a cycling sub theme in this deck. That's there's a couple engine cards like the card I'm about to read, Astral Slide, that really make cycling do things and make it even better than it is just digging through your deck. So I'll go ahead and read this card. It's called Astral Slide. It's 2 and a white for an enchantment, and it says whenever a player cycles a card, you may exile target creature. If you do, return the exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So obviously this card is really strong if you're going to be cycling a lot. You're going to be bouncing other people's creatures. You could use this in a number of different ways. If you want to maybe deny somebody value on their turn, like say I was playing Yarok and someone else playing Vic, they could exile my Yarok until the end of the end step just by cycling a card, which they can do at instant speed. So that's really powerful, really good engine for a control deck to just be able to kind of disrupt and deny value to people.
Right. Yeah. And again, that's pushing the game plan. His game plan is to control people. In this case, he's doing it through cycling by abusing these enchantments. He's gotten out for free. So, and not only, like Zach said, you can disrupt and delay, but he can also benefit himself by exiling into a turn a creature that has an ETB effect, like a Ravenous Chupacabra. So it enters again and destroys something. But again, everything we've said is just control. He's removing things. He's doing things on other people's turn that value him, delaying opponents, causing disruption. It's all part of the game plan. It's all to keep your opponents from doing anything, really. So doing all of that, what's he actually moving towards, Zach?
Yeah, so basically what you're moving towards is, in this case, infinite Drake tokens, or at least enough to close out the game, through a card called Drakehaven. So I'll go ahead and read the cards. Drakehaven's 2 and a blue for an enchantment, and whenever you cycle or discard a card, you can pay 1. And if you do, you can create a 2/2 blue Drake creature token with flying. So obviously this enchantment, again, works with cycling, is going to be even better with paired with something like Astral Slide, because basically, once you get to kind of this critical mass of do something when you cycle cards, you're just going to be getting a lot of value from a mechanic that is already good, and that you're just kind of pitching cards and searching for more cards. And basically, it's just once you have this engine out that Zer's kind of fetched you over the course of a few turns, you're really just getting so much value from something that you already want to be doing that you're just going to creep ahead of everyone else at the table.
Yeah, this is one of those decks that it doesn't have a straight up lay a card and win, but a bunch of cards together can just get you so far ahead because you're controlling. Like Drakehaven on its own is fine, right? You cycle, you get a 2/2 Drake, great. It doesn't blow anyone away. But all these enchantments he's laid out over time, and other effects that are controlling us, like there's the Archfiend of Ifnir that gives creatures neg1/neg1, so he's removing stuff. He's been countering spells. He's delaying us, bouncing us. He basically keeps us from playing the game. And so this Drakehaven, every turn he's making 2-3 Drakes, it just kind of adds up, and then he slowly whittles us away until we're dead. So again, it all comes full circle. He has an archetype of control chosen. He plays cards that stop us from playing the game. And because we can't play, he's free to just build up a board with something like Drakehaven, or drain us with something like, I don't remember what the black card, Devoted something. Oh, geez, what is it?
Yeah, I don't remember. You talking about the one that puts neg on counters on stuff, or are you talking about something?
Oh, Faith of the Devoted, the one that drains.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so if it's not an army of Drakes that he slowly built up that we can't stop, we're just going to be slowly drained by Faith of the Devoted anyway, which whenever you cycle, you pay 1 and drain every 1/2 life. So again, it's all come together to produce, it's almost like a harmony for all these decks, right? It sounds a little bit cheesy to say, but it really is the deck working in harmony with one another in the game plan, the archetype, the win con, all of it comes full circle to get you the win.
Yep, absolutely. All these kind of different things go hand in hand, and I think something else that we mentioned without explicitly saying it is just threat assessment and kind of making decisions throughout the game on when to play these cards, when to attack, who to attack. All these kind of things come together to really define what you're going to be doing in a game, how you're going to win. All of that really just goes hand in hand.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the reasons Zach and I love Magic, because it's almost infinite in that, one card could change a deck. You could build a deck a ton of ways. Each game's going to go different. Your decision making could, be totally different from one game to the other because you decided to remove this player as opposed to destroy this creature, or whatever it may be. It just, there's so many different ways everything could go down. So many ways to build a deck. So many commanders already, and they're always adding more. It's just a really fun environment to play in. And again, we're doing it in a budget format, and you heard us talk about some of the things that do change, but overall, you're still just playing Commander. You're still just playing Magic, and all these decks, like Zach, you said, they're all pretty unique and interesting and creative within the restrictions we've created.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, we've given some powerful examples here, but I think one of the nice things about budget is that you don't necessarily have to play the absolute best commander for the arsenal you're playing. Like I mentioned, I have a Phoenix deck. He's a good mill commander, but they're definitely probably better in mill, and there's self mill, and just a lot of different ways that you could go that would probably be better than that one. But I chose to play that because I just think it's really cool, and there are some interesting cards that I would probably never play in any other deck, really.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to look at it. We talk about wanting to win and trying to win, but it is all for fun at the end of the day. And as long as you're at the table with your buddies playing Magic, you're going to be having fun. So I think that pretty much wraps up the first part of this series with the commander of the analysis of a budget environment. Next time, we'll be tackling the deck itself, like all the different parts, the components, examples of each of these parts and components, how many cards you should run, where the budget should go, and all those different things. That in mind, Zach, is there anything you want to add on to the first part of our mini series before we close it out?
No, I think I said everything I wanted to say. Appreciate everybody listening. Thank you.
Yep, we really do appreciate it. And if you liked everything you just listened to and you're excited for the next episode, go ahead and subscribe, and you'll get a notification if you hit the bell that our next episode's out for this series. And the following one after that, it's going to be a 3-part series. Like the video if you enjoyed it. We also have a Twitter and a Discord server up that will be linked in the description below. And we're always trying to move forward, trying to produce good content, better content each week. We're really excited to jump into our first ever deck tech here in a couple episodes after the series closes out. And like Zach said, we just really appreciate you listening. Anything else, Zach, before we close her out? All right. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.